Greetings, humans of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you as usual from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA with some more historical insights. And since last week's episode was about the first female private detective, I thought it would be a good time to discuss the institution for which she worked. And that, of course, was the Pinkerton Detective Agency, because it has a vast history which is ingrained in the history of this country. And I will begin by discussing the life of the man who founded the Pinkerton Detective Agency and the man whose name it bears, Alan Pinkerton, because he lived a very interesting life. He was born near Glasgow, Scotland on July 21st, 1819, and as a young man he was involved in radical politics, and so he was forced to emigrate to America in 1842 after finding himself in hot water. And Pinkerton and his wife settled in the Chicago area, where he initially worked as a barrel maker, and initially he was quite happy in his role until he stumbled upon a gang of counterfeiters while looking for lumber on an island in the Fox River in Chicago. And the Scotsman conducted informal surveillance on the gang and was hailed as a local hero after he helped police make arrests. The affair was in everybody's mouth, Pinkerton later wrote, and I suddenly found myself called upon from every quarter to undertake matters requiring detective skill. And this, of course, won him great acclaim. And the resulting celebrity led to his appointment as a deputy sheriff and then as a special agent for the U.S. Post Office, where his success in catching criminals continued. And in 1850, Pinkerton established a private detective agency called the Northwest Police Agency. And in addition to being a devoted crime fighter, Pinkerton was also a committed abolitionist. In late 1858, when John Brown freed 11 slaves in a raid on 2 Missouri homesteads and set out to take them to freedom in Canada, Pinkerton raised some $500 and arranged for the transportation from Chicago to Detroit. If you listened to last week's episode, then you would know that his agency protected President-elect Abraham Lincoln during his trip to Washington to be sworn in. And Pinkerton also served as chief of intelligence for Union General George McClellan during the Civil War. And after the conflict was over, Pinkerton's agency continued to grow. And his agents infiltrated the first train robbing gang, the Reno Brothers, and collected photographs of known criminals to aid in their apprehension and capture. And one detail I should mention about the Pinkerton Agency was that its first contracts were with express companies, firms moving gold and valuables across the mountains and plains of the West. Think the Wells Fargo Company. And such contracts placed Pinkerton in the crosshairs, most notably the James Younger Gang. It happened in early 1874 after a train robbery by the James Gang in Gads Hills, Missouri. The Adams Express Company asked Pinkerton to bring the James brothers to justice. Express companies were paid to carry valuables on the railroads, and they, rather than the train companies, typically suffered the largest losses during robberies. And Pinkerton accepted the assignment and sent one of his detectives to Clay County, Missouri to investigate. That detective was a man named Joseph Witcher. He arrived in early March 1874 and made his way to the James homestead, despite being warned by a former sheriff the old woman would kill you if the boys didn't. Of course, he was referring to Jesse James's mother, Zerelda Cole. And Witcher was found murdered the next day. His death scared off the express company, but not Alan Pinkerton, who vowed vengeance on the outlaws who still supported the Confederacy. And he wrote of the James brothers, "There is no use talking, they must die." And in January 1875, a group of Pinkerton detectives and sympathetic locals raided the James farm, but their plans went awry when an incendiary device they tossed into the house exploded, which wounded Zerelda and killed Jesse's 8-year-old half-brother, Archie. Public opinion rallied to the James family as never before, and the Pinkerton Agency was reprimanded for the raid by the American public. Stung with defeat, Pinkerton gave up the chase. Jesse James would go on to elude the authorities for another 7 years before being killed by an assassin's bullet in 1882. And Pinkerton also helped revolutionize law enforcement. One of these ways was through an early mugshot system. This was their so-called rogues gallery, which was a collection of mugshots and case histories that the agency used to research and keep track of wanted men, along with noted suspects, distinguished marks and scars. Agents also collected newspaper clippings and generated rap sheets detailing their previous arrests, known associates, and areas of expertise. A more sophisticated criminal library wouldn't be assembled until early 20th century and the birth of the FBI. It should also be noted that Alan Pinkerton was a masterful publicist who spun his agency's real-life adventures into legend through the new medium of dime novels. He wrote more than 17 books in just 9 years. And Alan Pinkerton's life came to a sudden and bizarre end when in 1884 he bit his tongue in a fall and later perished from gangrene. And after his death, his agency marched on, but to a different tune. The company's leadership now fell to his two sons, Robert Pinkerton and William Pinkerton, who shared a last name with their father, but not much else. And unlike Alan Pinkerton, who, since his early years, held in great sympathy for working class people, Robert and William Pinkerton had grown up in the lap of luxury, and so they sought to revamp their father's agency as a hired army for America's wealthiest industries, pursuing not bandits, but labor unions and striking workers. This would explode in 1892, when industrialists used them to spy on unions or act as guards and strikebreakers, and detectives clashed with workers on several occasions. And during an 1892 strike by the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, the Carnegie Steel Company, the Carnegie Steel Company, that's how it's properly pronounced, Carnegie, paid some 300 Pinkertons to act as security at its mill in Homestead, Pennsylvania. And after arriving at the plant on river barges, the agents squared off with thousands of striking workers in an all-day battle waged with guns, bricks, and even dynamite. And by the time the outnumbered Pinkertons finally surrendered, at least a dozen people were dead and several more were wounded. The fallout from the attack crippled the steel union, but many also branded the Pinkertons as hired thugs, which led to several states to pass laws banning the use of outside guards in labor disputes. However, breaking up union fights was nothing new to the Pinkerton Agency. In 1877, the Pinkertons were hired to bust the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which involved over 100,000 workers. The resulting conflict left about 100 dead. And around the same time, the Pinkerton detective James McParland was assigned to infiltrate the Marley McGuires, which was a secret society of Irish immigrants coal miners who allegedly resorted to violent tactics in their fight for better pay and safer working conditions. McParland spent much of 1876 working among the Marley McGuires, gaining their trust and eventually gathering enough evidence to send 10 of their leaders to the gallows. After a Pinkerton agent killed a 15-year-old bystander during an 1887 dock workers strike in Jersey City, New Jersey, the United Labor Party declared that the Pinkerton men go from state to state committing murders for which none of them are ever brought to trial. And as more of these stories broke out, the public became increasingly alarmed by the Pinkertons' violent tactics. And following the passage of the new law which I previously mentioned, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency would continue to work with private companies. However, the rise of the FBI and modernized police forces eventually rendered their services obsolete, finally bringing an end to the Pinkerton era. However, that was not the end of the agency itself. In 1906, Pinkerton had 20 different offices throughout the United States. In 1925, Alan Pinkerton, the grandson of Alan Pinkerton Sr., incorporated the agency and became its first president. So, as a private security firm and guard service. And in 1942, industrial guard services increased during wartime. And in 1967, when Robert Pinkerton II died without a male heir, the family direction of the corporation came to an end. The company was later bought out by Securitas AB, a Swedish security company, and it still exists as a subsidiary of Securitas to this day. And during the 1960s, the company really began to grow. In 1962, Pinkerton agents escorted the Mona Lisa safely across the Atlantic Ocean. That same year, the Pinkertons also guarded Marilyn Monroe's casket at her funeral. And in 1965, the agency name changes to Pinkerton Inc. to reflect its function in supplying security services to many different types of vendors. In 1969, the Pinkerton offices were opened in Hong Kong, opening doors to operations in Asia. In 1998, Pinkerton successfully evacuates 431 expatriates from Indonesia during the Asian currency crisis. Little side note here, by the way, the term private eye originated from the Pinkertons. That's right, you heard that correctly, the Pinkertons. The company's early logo featured a giant eyeball with the phrase, "We never sleep," written underneath it. And so we got the term private eye. Well, folks, I think that we have learned that sometimes a company's original intention might not always continue. Sometimes you can go from rounding up outlaws one minute to gangbusting labor unions the next, and sometimes your descendants can muck up an entire company. Just ask Robert and William Pinkerton, whose father, I am sure, would not appreciate what they did with the Pinkerton Detective Agency after he was gone. We have also learned that sometimes a company can change, and they can redeem themselves by protecting very important artifacts. And with that, I will now have to bid you good day, goodbye, and God bless.